I really think that this Humberette here is just outstanding. When I came here and saw the collection, this is just so wonderful. The way this is displayed next to the Oldsmobile, and let me say why it's outstanding. You have to understand, in Great Britain, a company like the Humber Company here was involved with bicycle production, which was very typical of car manufacturers way back when. And yet they came out with a car. But look at the wheels, and they look like bicycle wheels. So you can really tell that. And in 1903, to have a car like this meant you had money, you had position, you had status. It was really outstanding to have a car like that. Be it ever so humble, there's your Humberette. Now in America it's a little different because you've got the curved dash Oldsmobile. A wonderful design, curved dash, that's the dash right there, curved just like on a buggy. And the interesting story about the success of this car, this is the first successful mass-produced car in America. It really is. It wasn't the Model T because Ransom E. Olds mass-produced his Oldsmobile here even before the Model T was thought of. But what he ended up doing is coming out with a car, a one-model car. It was just one type of car, and it wasn't his choice. There was a fire in the factory, and the only thing saved from the factory was one model. They pulled it out of the building. And based upon that, they took new measurements, they drew new plans, they made new designs, and they mass-produced that car to help bring in enough cash to save the company, and it did. And of course, it resulted in Oldsmobile lasting until just recently. So it's really wonderful to see an American success story that looks a lot like the Hummer success story, the Humberette here, over in Great Britain. It shows how the automobile was spanning the ocean.
Marvelous.
Does that sound pretty good to you?
Oh, that's good.
Hey, Bill, why don't you hop in here and why don't you give us just a real quick idea of where and when you got all of these vehicles? Like, where did you pick up the Humberette? Any pedigree information that you might have on this one?
Well, this car came through an auction not too far from here at Wellsville. Gary may know Bill McLean. You probably know Bill McLean. And it was a surprise to me that this little car was in his collection. And I got it that day. And after I got it, my daughter, Carolyn, learned about it. And so next thing I know, well, I had a little book on Humberette. And I got to peeling through the book and reading, scanning, and came to a picture, and surprise, surprise, this car was in that book. And you knew that it was this car because when they issue a license plate in England, that license plate stays with the car all of its life. And that license plate is on the back, and it's supposed to be on the front. But that license plate is on the back of this car. So the book was written with this car in mind. Very, very, very unusual. Yeah. Yeah.
How about the Olds, the runabout? This is this one of the originals, or is this one?
This is a replica.
This is the replica.
But it's a pretty good replica.
Yeah.
It's a better replica than most of them. And I have two of these. This one is this one is the little truck. You probably can't see that, but made it up as a little truck, and it's a runnable car. It has an engine in it, and it will run. I've driven this one.
Did you build this one, Bill?
Oh no, these were kits. Well, they're not necessarily kits. They were replicas, and they're not 100%. No replica is 100% of originals.
Sure.
But some of them are pretty close. These were pretty close. Yeah.
All right, let's cut there.
Lambert is an interesting name also, Bill, and this is so wonderful you preserved this car over the years for everyone to enjoy that comes here to the museum. Because it's a two-cylinder, isn't it?
That's right.
It's a two-cylinder, and it has friction drive. Now, I know a little bit about this car and the history of the company. It was made in Anderson, Indiana, as I recall.
That's right.
And one day, Elwood Haynes, who made the Haynes automobile, which is a very popular make of car that lasted well into the 20s, showed up and visited with Mr. Lambert and said, "You know, I'm going to make America's first car." And Mr. Lambert did not disagree, even though his car predated. He was already operating in the serious end of car manufacturing as early as the early 1890s, 1891 through 1893. It was just outstanding that he was able to do that, and he really was among the very first cars made in America. I love the transmission on this. This is not a 3-speed. It never was a 3-speed.
No.
Back then, you had what was called friction drive. And there's a big plate, big metal plate in here that comes off of the 2-cylinder engine, and that metal plate turns this way. And then there's a big wheel that comes this way, and it has special traction surface on it. So as the one wheel turns, the other wheel connects to that, and then it starts to turn the wheels in the back. So this is a multiple speed transmission. You could make this go at any speed you wanted with basically one shift, and you stayed in that until you wanted to go to another shift. So anywhere on that big wheel, you could position that other drive wheel to go against it. Very crude, but it was very good and operational. It just didn't pull a whole lot of hills, and if that one big drive wheel surface got dirty, you were done.
But it also would go theoretically as fast backwards as it would forward, unless there was some kind of a stop in there to keep you from doing that.
So if you had to get away from somebody up front, you were covered.
Yeah.
Great car.
So,
This, of course, is not the early car. The early car was 1891, and it did predate Haynes, and it predated Duryea. And I want to say that loud and clear. The great mass of the public and all of the publications come through with Duryea. Well, Duryea did build, I think, 13 cars in their original group. And so the industry, or the publishers anyway, have given the Duryea the first up, which was really not the case.
One reason that happened is because when a lot of the old timers got together in the 30s and even late 40s, someone had to take credit for inventing the automobile. And the Duryeas got credit not so much for inventing the first automobile in America, but for mass producing, or for producing the first automobile. So by making 13 of the same model, they started the industry. So they were seen as the founders of the automobile industry. But there were individuals that were making cars before that. The thing is, they weren't making many, and in the case of Lambert, he made a car, but he really didn't get into the business too much. He was easing into it. And maybe it was because of Haynes that he decided to jump into the business like he did.
Well, Haynes had the manufacturing part of it. They had the shop.
True.
And Lambert would take his drawings and his ideas to Haynes, and they built a lot of I'm assuming, basically the mechanicals.
And we would be remiss if we didn't add the Apperson brothers.
Oh yeah.
Because they were the ones who were really in the mechanical end also. So it was Haynes, Apperson initially until they broke and each formed their own companies thereafter. I've been to Kokomo. It's interesting. Kokomo, Indiana is where all this took place, where the Haynes and the Apperson were both made, and before that combined in the same name. And even now, the Haynes company continues in some form, and they've been involved with coming up with certain types of metallurgy, metals, that are used in space travel, based upon the technology of Elwood Haynes. Outstanding. So he was a true inventor and a true visionary, not only in the automobile industry, Bill, but in America even to this day, even though he's been long gone.
Well, then we don't want to leave out the Haynes that I did have for a while, the 1894, 95 Haynes that was in the museum, in the original museum on Kmart. And the people in Kokomo wanted that car very bad. We talked for about 4 years. They finally got their their local news media people on it, and came to me and said, if you take X number of dollars for this car, we'll promote it that way, and we just have to have this car. And I couldn't in good conscience keep them from having it. It was built in Kokomo, belonged in Kokomo, went back to Kokomo, and believe it or not, I was king for a day in Kokomo when I delivered that car back to them.
You know what this brings up, Bill? A great story, and it points out that people who collect old cars today are just caretakers. They keep the cars for a while, but they're going to pass these cars on to another generation, and hopefully they'll pass those cars on to another generation, just as these have been passed down to the collection today. So it just shows that caretakers, that's really what a car historian and a car buff is.
Well, these, yeah, in a big way. The cars that you're going to see here today, they have been preserved. They've been restored, yes. Some of them more than others. But in the main, as Jerry is saying, they now have good care. They're in the dry and they're in a controlled heat, sprinklered building, short of something totally unforeseen. They now are going to be preserved in perpetuity, which is a long time.
And you know, they're sitting here waiting for people to see. So why don't we take a stroll down and look at some of the other cars in the collection?
Ready.
All right.
Cut.
Okay, on this particular car, when I first saw this particular car, it was, Jerry, it was at Hershey. It was at Hershey. And I wish I could think of the fellow that had it was pretty proud of it, justly. And I approached him. No, I knew what comes first, you know, in this automobile, U.S. automobile business, and that Lambert stood right in there as very prominent, very prominent. So I may think of his name before it's over with. But anyway, it was unrestored. It was just like this, kind of a rat trap. But then I purposely have left it this way. This and the, well, I guess this is the only 100% unrestored car in here. And there's just two in here that won't run. This is one of them. But anyway, I propositioned him on this car at Hershey. And no way. So I said, well, here's my card. If you ever think a little different, well, give me a call. And I don't know, it was probably 6 or 8 months later. Well, he called me and says, well, let's talk about that car. Let's talk about that car a little more. And that's okay. So to make a long story short on the dollars, we did get together, and for some reason or another he was going west, and he even brought it to me. So it was just this way at Hershey. It was just this way all the time that I've had it at Kmart, and it's still this way, and it's going to stay this way. I'm not going to restore this car. I think it deserves to. This does two things. It shows the public that a lot or most of the cars that everybody has gone down. They've gone down through the years, and a lot of them, mainly the weather, has eaten off 3, 4, 5 inches of the rest of the bodies, and like you can't see it in that picture, but the fenders, the low parts of the bodies, the weatherman has devoured them. And there's been patching done on them, and some of them have had brand new parts put on them. But this car has had none of that. This is just the way that it survived, barely. Cut.
1909 black is representative of something that was unique to America, and that is the high wheeler. Notice how high these wheels are. It just kind of knocks you down to realize that a car like this really was made to function on the roads of America way back when. And the reason they succeeded, and they were made specifically for the Midwestern roads in America, is because these wheels would sink down into the mud of the old dirt roads, and it would sink down to the point where there was finally a hard enough surface, undersurface I guess you'd call it, where they gained traction. So sometimes they'd go down a foot, and the wheels were so high that you still had enough clearance underneath. Everything was up high on the undercarriage of this. Basically, it's a buggy converted into a motorized vehicle. This was not done in this fashion over in Great Britain. It was done nowhere else except in America, and it is credited with being the first truly American design of the automobile. It didn't last long. It started out about 1906 when this trend developed, and by 1916 it was done, and other trends were coming about. But until then, the high wheeler was a pretty fast growing business, and the black was a good name among the different companies. Others such as Sears and International also made high wheelers. International made nearly 20,000 over a certain span of time that I mentioned, which was a lot of cars back then. Realize that most companies would exist successfully if they produced and sold about 300 cars a year. So black was in good shape if it would make 50 to 100 cars a year. So the black name is respected among people that understand the old high wheelers. Now I want to point over here to this buggy, because there you see the old buggy wheels, and a lot of times those wheels were just converted over into, again, the high wheeler motif. However, because the high wheelers could do the outstanding speed of 20 miles an hour or less, usually 10 to 15 was as fast as you would go, otherwise you'd start to affect the different bearings in the wheels. But because of that, they had to spiff up those wheels and make a little sturdier series of spokes. So the actual buggy or wagon design of old did not carry over 100%. The car makers had to beef it up because of the horsepower that was being added. Now, Bill, I know you've got both of these cars here in the display. Come on over here and talk to me a little bit. I'd like to know how you got this black.
Well, the black,
That's a tough question, huh?
there were blacks built in Indianapolis, and there were blacks built in Chicago, right?
Yes.
And it's hard to tell which car you have. There's nothing on the car, I don't think, that indicates the origin, the builder of it.
What that also reflects is there are a lot of companies that were rising up very quickly, and they didn't communicate in those old days like we communicate today. So you could have 5 or 6 different companies carrying the same name. Like, for example, the name Lincoln. We know what a Lincoln is today, but that's the Lincoln that started out in 1921. But there were 5 previous brands of Lincolns that had no connection at all with that company, some of them being produced at the same time in different parts of the land.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, we learn something every day in history. That's why car history is so intriguing.
Well, talking about a Lincoln then, Leland, that, most of the Lincolns that we know of were early on Leland.
Henry Leland.
Lincolns.
Yeah, Henry Leland made those. And the first person that he voted for in a presidential election was Abraham Lincoln. So he had to name the car the Lincoln. And that car started coming out in late 20 and through 1921. Then, of course, he had to sell the company because a recession hit, and it went over to Henry Ford. And when men like that, Bill, were looking at the industry and how it was changing and adapting, they really were continuing the tradition that really had been established by companies like Black and some of the other car makers here, Lambert, Oldsmobile. These were companies that were pioneer companies in the industry, and the others were coming in a little later, including Henry Ford, to get things going in a different direction.
Is my Rio in here?
Mm-hmm.
It is? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit.
We'll talk about the Rio in just a bit. Good.
Yeah,
Okay.
Rio versus Olds.
Great.
Uh,
Anything more about the Black before we head on?
No, I bought that car up in Wisconsin, I believe. And that fellow was really a dealer. You probably know him. I can't think of his name right now. But anyway, as Jerry said, they were built to follow the mud roads, the tracks that the wagons had already made in the mud roads. Now, while we're on that subject, talk about the Dixie tread on the Model T.
No, you start on that one, because
Uh-huh.
I like the way you tell that story. And I'll tell you something else about the wagon tracks after you tell the Dixie story. Go ahead.
All right.
You're on a roll.
All right. Dave, could you kind of swing a little bit to that car right there? That's your Model T.
Yeah, I'll get you, and then I'll shoot the car separate. Because if I swing this way, I won't be able to hear you.
So just keep going like you are,
Okay.
Bill. You do fine.
So that's a standard wheel width track Model T. The wagons, the southern wagons, had a little wider track, and I don't know how much. What, 4 or 5
Usually about
inches?
4 inches.
And so the cars, the Model Ts anyway, that were built for the southern states had what they call the Dixie track. So they were wider. They actually were wide. The tracks were wider. Nothing else on the car. I mean, the fenders and everything else. Isn't that right?
That's correct. The only thing they extended, and by the way, the fenders back in those days were 6 or 7 inches wide. So you could take that wheel, and instead of having a dead center, you'd move it out about 2 more inches on each side. So you can tell what people also call a wide track. You could tell those vehicles because the wheels are out closer to the edge of the fender. Here's the top of the fender, and out this far makes it probably a wide track versus in the middle. And those southern wagons had this tendency to be built wider because they would carry the cotton and the tobacco and whatever else they needed, and that's just the way they were built down there. The northern wagons were a little different. Now, the important thing about having a wide track car, automobile, in the South was in the summertime, it didn't matter if the roads turned muddy, you just plowed through the mud. Didn't matter. But when that mud started to get hard, when it dried out, or if you were a little more northerly and it maybe froze up, you'd have these awful tracks and gullies and ruts to go through. And if your car didn't match up with that, you would break a wheel or you'd break an axle. And so you needed to have the wide track to match the old wagon trails, basically, and how they would trail down those roads in the South. And that's the rest of the story, as they'd say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting bit of history when it comes to the name Dodge, and it just pops into mind right away. You know, Bill, that's what happens when you get into the car hobby. You walk up to a car, and it's not just that you're looking at a car, but you're looking at a piece of preserved history. And with that comes this rush of recollection or rush of information that you might have read or you might have heard about. But interesting story behind a Dodge. I can't see any of the early Dodges like this without thinking about Henry Ford.
Right.
Yeah, and you know the story about that, don't you?
You sure do.
Yeah, Henry Ford was making bunches of money with his Model T. He was not the first mass-produced car in America, but he more or less perfected, some people would say he perfected the movable assembly line for automobile production better than anybody else. And as he was doing that, he needed to have more and more parts, and he couldn't make all the parts himself. So he would have various things made by some people called the Dodges, 2 brothers. And these 2 Dodge brothers were very good at making fenders and body parts and running gears and even the engines they would make. And they'd ship all these parts over to Henry Ford's plant, and then the Ford people would assemble these. So really early on, some of those early Fords were really assembled cars. They were parts from all different places coming together in one. Henry Ford even got to the point where when he'd place an order, he would say, now that crate that you ship the parts in has to be so big by so big. And the people were wondering why. And Bill, you know the story. What did he do with those crates?
Use them for floorboards.
Yeah, for floorboards and you know anything else he wanted them for. And what he'd do is he said, I'm buying the parts. I might as well buy the crate too and use the crate. Very efficient man. And so he would take that and benefit and pass that benefit along to the car buyer because then the price of the car could be brought down. And the Model T Ford was among the cheapest priced successful cars in our history. Now go back to the Dodge story. The Dodge brothers made so much money with what they had done for Henry Ford, they started getting all this stock because Henry Ford didn't always have the money to pay, but he'd give them stock in the company. So finally they decided, hey, we've done well enough with Henry Ford, we could make our own car under the name Dodge. So that's what they did. They took their money, they tried to cash in as much as they could. Henry Ford hated it, tried to take him to court, tried to stop him. No, it didn't work out. The Dodge brothers still beat the system, so to speak, and they were able to launch the Dodge automobile. And one nice thing about the Dodge, it was not very typical for its day, they concentrated early on solid steel construction. They did away with a lot of the wood. Maybe it's because Henry Ford was using all the wood in the Model Ts, I don't know. But it's an interesting bit of history that just kind of rushes up on a person if they know that connection between Dodges and Fords.
Well, and Dodge built a lot sturdier car, along with, like you say, the steel, got rid of a lot of the wood, but they built a car that was really more reliable and tougher than the Model T. A lot of difference in the engine that ended up in Dodge, and more particularly in the transmission that ended up in Dodge. A crazy thing about the transmission in a Dodge is that it's in there backwards, is what most people think, compared to all modern floor shift vehicles. Reverse is down where you normally have high gear, and a lot of these old Dodges ended up as power plants for sawmills, and well, a lot of them sawmills or pumps or whatever. They were quite a power plant, and a lot of them are still in. Well, I'd say there's probably still in service. These old Dodge engines, these old Dodge power plants.
Quite a few that have survived over the
Yeah.
years, and that's a salute to that rugged construction.
Yeah.
Where did you pick this one up, Bill? Where did you get this car? Do you remember?
Oh, this was an easy one. This came from the city of Fulton. A fellow by the name of Eddie Gelder, who'd been in the trucking business, clay hauling, basically, and he did some of the restoration on this himself. Had other parts restored on it, and he died a little bit of an early death, and his son ended up with it. The son didn't have the love affair for the vehicle that the dad had. He didn't totally cave in on the price, but it was reasonable price. And when you get down to what I have done to or had done to this car, and it's exactly zero. This is the way that the car came to me.
Great.
Kelsey here is a wonderful car to show you basic features of automobiles way back when. You had to have a horn, so it's right here. Easy to reach and all. Notice it's right-hand drive. People say, well, isn't that British? No, not really. Until about 1915, nearly every American car was right-hand drive. And it was after 1915, for a variety of reasons, that the wheel moved to the other side. And when it did, of course, it established a pattern that was an American way of driving. But to enter the car back in the old days, chances are you entered more on that side than this side. You could enter here, there's a little step plate, but you'd have to wiggle around and fit in the seat. Notice these are truly bucket seats. I mean, you can't get more than a normal-sized person for the day back in there. A large person by today's standards, a tall person by today's standards would have a tough time of going in there. Besides that, you can't move the seat back. These were all typical things that car makers contended with back in the old days. The other thing is, and Bill, does this have the seat in front?
I don't think so. I think that's just a little toolbox.
All right, this is a toolbox. Some cars had their tool compartment here. This is not where the engine is. The engine is underneath the seats, basically. But you either had the option to get your trunk, if you will, would be right here in the front instead of the back. Or in some cars, you would lift this part up. This would be the backrest. This part would flip down, and that would be the footrest, and you'd have a seat right here, and you'd have passengers in front. Early on, that became dangerous because people realized if you did more than 10 miles an hour and you had to stop suddenly or swerve, your passengers in front had nothing to grab onto. There was no railing, no dashboard, and they'd go flying off, and guess what would roll over them? So they got rid of that type of technique, and they put the people to the back. Now, Bill, there's something outstanding about this car in the back. I notice it's got these two wonderful white tires in the front, which is very typical of the time. White was really in, not white wall tires, but entire white tires. You'd only get about 1,000 miles before you'd have to replace a whole set. But in the back, they beat that problem because this car doesn't take a set of 4 tires. How many wheels does it have, Bill?
Well, turns out it's a 3-wheel car.
You're right.
It's chain driven. There's a major economy that can be had here by doing this. There's no need for a differential in the rear axle, so it's a much simpler arrangement. It has its downfall, however. major downfall to this car is it's top heavy, and this single wheel in the back is the main culprit for that. Now, we kind of poo-pooed the fact that there's no front fender on this car, and that's because when we were bringing it to the museum, and initially I was riding here, and my friend Harris Lee Wallace was pulling me, and we went over a little grade that was a little bit too slopey and ended up with it upside down. Lost the fender in the process.
But you know, that was typical of motoring back in the early days. And if you could walk away from an accident, you were lucky. So you're lucky, Bill. You walked away.
I felt real lucky. The fender is in the back seat. This is a restored car from Harris collection, which has quite a bit of import in the game. You want to talk about Harris a little bit?
Yeah, Bill Harrah was a big collector out west. He got into the gambling business early on and was a very fine man, a very good individual, especially in the hobby. And his collection numbered well over 1,000 within a matter of about 10 years. He and Jack Nethercutt were two of the big collectors out in California or out on the West Coast. Nethercutt was in California. And the two would often trade cars or sell cars back and forth. And anyway, Bill Harrah died a little bit prematurely, and certain things were not as set up, perhaps legally, as maybe some people in the hobby would have wanted. So the collection was going to come up for auction, and basically the collection has gone out now to the four winds. There is a core of cars that were established under a new foundation, and they are viewable out west. But the other cars typical of this type, are now throughout the country and even overseas. But by so doing, again, Mr. Harrah was preserving and being the caretaker of cars up to a point, and now many of those have transferred over to other people and other places like this museum.
That first breakup of the Harris collection went to Holiday Inn.
That's correct.
If I'm thinking right, and Holiday Inn didn't keep it together. The city of Reno, I think, set up a special fund or tried. Yeah, they did.
With the help of a lot of collectors behind it, yes.
And they built an in-town museum in Reno. Harris collection was not in the city of Reno. It was kind of out in the country. And what do you have, about 4,000?
The numbers vary, but it goes into the thousands. And the thing is, there were cars he had that he sold. And so how many cars he owned over his lifetime, I don't know that anybody can really say. He probably couldn't even recall. And he tried to get one of every Packard style that was made, one of every year. And Packard made cars from 1899 up through 1958. And I think he was minus 1 or 2 years of having every year represented. Of course, it would be hard to represent the first year since only one Packard was made, and that car is already in a different museum. So he knew he'd never be able to do that. But the other thing, Bill, that's outstanding is he established his own restoration facility. Full-time employees that would do research on vehicles and also do all the work that needed to be done to bring those up to a #1 condition. And a car that had been in the Harris collection usually has a mystique around it that people stand in awe of in the collection, in the old car hobby.
Well, in that they tried and did, if they needed a part, they wouldn't fake it. They would search until they found the part that really belonged on the car. They would have ads in the trade magazines asking anybody that had that particular part, and I don't think the price made any difference.
It didn't.
They were going to have it.
They would have it, even if the part was broken. They would take the pieces, put them together, and they would remake the part based upon that pattern. And a lot of times what they do is they would research to great depth, going through old original brochures, booklets, owner's manuals, anything they could, even magazines, to picture exactly what they needed. And by so doing, they established one of the great research centers. And now I've got to add that the Nethercutt collection is one of the collections, premier collections out west, that continues that tradition. And Skip Marchetti, who had been involved with the Auburn Court Duesenberg Museum, has been active out there over the recent years, and he can tell you that the research files that they have, and the reference that they are able to offer is quite amazing.
Oh, it had to be fabulous because they spent a lot of money on this paperwork approach
Yes.
to it. Along with doing the cars, there's tremendous amount of research and paper documenting things that, and documenting their own cars in convincing the public that they were authentic. Yeah.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on.
All right. Okay, we're going to start this off by talking about Oldsmobile, the curved dash Oldsmobile we talked about earlier, and it was pretty early in the game. I think about 1905 or something like that. Vehicles had been made just a few years that Olds sold his company and sold his name, therefore lost it, but he still had the desire to build a vehicle. So he went back into the business, and as you'll notice, the letters on the front of this car says R-E-O, Rio, and most of the people say that's just a Rio. Well, it's actually Ransom Eli Olds, and that's where the name Rio comes from. It's not much different from the cars that he'd been making before. Bigger car though. Got that one.
Yes, sir. Their plan is.
And we're rolling.
Whenever I come up to a Packard, I pause because it reminds me how I really got seriously into the old car hobby. My first old car was a 1956 Chevrolet two-door Series 210. A nice car. I would take it along to shows and just enjoyed it. Drove it. It was my daily driver, and I refurbished it. One day, I was with my wife-to-be in a little town in Missouri at a car show, and it was on a Saturday, as I recall. And as we came walking up to this one car, I said, "Oh, I wonder what that is. If I ever get another old car, it's going to have to look like that." And it was a 1937 Packard. Well, we're standing next to another Packard right now, and it's very similar but not identical to a 37. But I do want to point out the outstanding design. It's called the ox yoke design on the radiator, just like the yoke that went over the neck of an ox. Packard designed that. Packard was the first successful mass producer of luxury cars in the world. And people a lot of times say, well, Packard was the Rolls-Royce of America, and that's not true, because Packard existed from 1899 until 1956 in the luxury field, and then the name continued for 2 more years on a glorified Studebaker through 58. But what Packard was able to do is they came out in 1904 with this radiator design. Now, it wasn't exactly this dimension, but it had this design at the top. That was before Rolls-Royce was even into production. And so I like to say that Packard was never the Rolls-Royce of America, but Rolls-Royce was the Packard of Great Britain. This is truly a wonderful car. It has a huge straight-8 engine in it. Packard also came out with V12s. They never made a V16 because they said it was not a well-balanced design. Packard engineering was always superb, and Packard dominated the luxury car field for many years up to 1950 when Cadillac finally took over. But there was one company that really dominated the field right before Packard took it over, and that was Pierce Arrow. And I'm going to walk over here to this Pierce Arrow. This is a 1926 Model 80. This is not the biggest Pierce Arrow or the most expensive Pierce ever made, but it is the one that really gained a lot of notoriety for the company. The Series 80 was basically 80 horsepower. That's a simple way of remembering it. The engine was made by Pierce Arrow in Buffalo, New York. Now, Packard was over in the Detroit area during this same period of time, and they were mass producing and doing very well there. But yes, there were cars that were made outside of Detroit, folks, and the Pierce Arrow was one of the very successful names. The outstanding feature of Pierce had was this faired-in headlight design. See, it just kind of goes right into the fender. They had the patent for that. No one else in the whole world could produce a headlight like that. If they would produce a headlight like this, they'd have to get permission from Pierce. Pierce would not give that away. So what happened is, when Pierce Arrow went out of business in 1938, there was nobody around to defend the patent anymore. It became available, and all the cars in America came out with headlights in the fenders. You can imagine if Pierce Arrow were still in business today and would still have this patent and wouldn't let anybody else use it, then all the cars you'd be driving right now would not have those headlights in the fenders. Pierce Arrow was really a luxury car, a cut above most others, until Packard came along and started cutting into the lead. So today, if you go up to a Pierce Arrow collector and you mention the name Packard, they'll say, boo! And you mention the name Pierce to a Packard person, then they'll say, yes, that was a good car. It's an intriguing way in which this interchange goes on between collectors, but it is truly fun. And it's amazing, and again, part of our great history. Now, Bill probably has more to say about these two cars, so I'm going to step back and let him take it from here. Bill?
Yeah, Bill, come on in.
Well, getting back to the Packard first, this particular car and the companion car to it, which is a blue, and it's over in the other part of the museum, 7-passenger limousine. We were invited to put a couple of significant cars into the background of the great race about 5 years ago. So we actually drove. We didn't load them and carry them. We actually drove this car and the blue car, and we drove the Pierce Arrow to Jefferson City and made them the background of the car, of their lunch. Yeah. Of course, those fellows were all hung up on the thing that they were doing, so they were. Well, anyway, I was pretty proud of being invited to do that. They knew that I had some nice cars, and we did drove over for them. And they run great. They're heavy, they're stiff steering, no power steering, no power brakes. So when you're driving one of these cars, you're definitely driving the car. Nowadays you get in a car and you get it rolling a little bit and you push the cruise control and have the power steering and power this and power that, and it's a different story. The Pierce Arrow, I think, is even a more different story. Jerry didn't get into the mechanics or the whatever of it, but even though these two cars are probably about the same weight, this car, steering wise, is not anywhere as near hard to steer as that car, and I don't know why, but you feel like you're driving a truck in a way, because it is so solid and the shift is so solid, but the steering is relatively light to be a 1926 car, and I do love it. And I've been asked many times if I could have only one car, and you saw that out in the little show. I would have to keep the red Model T Ford. It's my driver, it's my true driver, and then this car. I think those would be the two cars. If I could have only two cars, those would be the two cars that I would keep out of the collection. Hopefully it never comes to that.
St. Clair, there are not many of those around. I love the flying goose on the radiator badge. The emblem is just very reminiscent of how this car was supposed to have sleek, smooth, practically airborne power as it would go down the road. Now, Mr. Wills had been with Ford originally, and he departed and started to make his own car. And a lot of these cars are considered real classics by car collectors today. The engine design was innovative, and I won't go into great detail. You come to the museum, you can look at the sign and get all those facts and all that information. But among car collectors, when you come up to a Will St. Clair, you stand in awe for just a moment if you really understand the history behind it. Because this car helped with innovations in automobile manufacturing that went way beyond the limit of this company itself. And this is a 1922 example. Notice very typical styling of the 20s, Fenders far out, headlights in between fender and radiator. You do have a functional core in the radiator. There's no grill. This is not a grill. This is the radiator. As time goes on, you did away with that and a grill was put on. We're going to walk now to the Willis Knight. And this car is great because it has a Knight sleeve valve engine. We're talking about engines now and technology. That meant that you didn't have the typical valves we think of in cars made in even the 50s and 60s and 70s. But you had a sleeve that would go up and down. And they advertised that the car improves with use when it had carbon buildup. It would create more of a seal and you'd have better pressure, and the car was just very smooth. You'd have to usually rebuild your valves and grind the valves and all every 20 to 30,000 miles. It was not untypical to do that, but with a Willis Knight, you didn't do that at all. It had no valves to grind. So you just kept getting that carbon on there and you didn't have to do anything about it. It helped the engine. So in the days when gasoline had an octane rating of about 50 to 60 at best and had a lot of impurities in there, a car like this with this type of engine was great. It just made a lot of sense. It was very, what shall we say, realistic to keep a car like this on the road. And this car is a 1926 example. You can see a slight difference in the styling. Bigger headlights. Notice the radiator design. The shell is a little fancier, very typical of the time. And it has this dog bone device here with what's called a motometer. And this gives you the temperature of the engine. Eventually, just a couple years after this, that gauge would end up on the dashboard where it's been ever since. Now we're going to go over to the third in our trio right here. And this one right here is a 1929 Cord. Not a Ford, but a Cord. Eric Loban Cord made his money selling Moon automobiles, which were made in St. Louis, but he was operating out of Chicago. And in Chicago, they had the greatest sales market at the time for Moon. More cars were made and sold from Moon to Mr. Cord than any other location. He was just the dominant salesman, made so much money he finally decided to go into automobile production himself. So he bought the Auburn Company in Auburn, Indiana, which was a long-standing company, very successful, very prestigious name. But he wanted to come out with even more prestige, so he was able to fold into the company the Duesenberg operation. So now he had Auburn and Duesenberg, which was considered one of the epitome cars, not the only epitome, but one of the epitome cars on the American scene. In between, he came out with a car named after himself, the Cord. Later in his life, he went into aviation. And so he carried over these principles of fast, smooth, sleek styling, aerodynamic design, and good performance as though it was an airplane lifting off of the runway. He had that in his cars way back when. So the Cord here had to be innovative, and the way he made it innovative, you see it right down here in this hump area, that's the transmission. The transmission is in front because it's a front-wheel drive car. The biggest thing that went against the Cord back in 1929, this is a model L29 front-wheel drive, the first really truly successful mass-produced front-wheel drive car in America. The thing that went against this in the mind of the public was the public thought you can't have a car pull you up a hill. You need wheels and back that push you up a hill. And yet, Mr. Cord would be fast to mention that the horse that was pulling the buggy was up front, pulling the car. So the pulling power was in the front. He really was fooling himself because absolutely a wagon was pushed. And how can I say that? The horse doesn't pull a wagon. It pushes against the harness and all the mechanism. And as it pushes against that, it's really pushing the vehicle up the hill, even though it looks like it's pulling it. Be that as it may, he came up with the first successful front-wheel drive car. Out of St. Louis, which is not too far from here, there was the Ruxton, which was another front-wheel drive car, and those two were going to compete. The Ruxton fell by the wayside very quickly due to the Depression. But the Cord continued, and later on in the 1930s, the mid-1930s, 35 and 36, they came out with the next generation Cord. But in its day, this was highly innovative and wonderfully styled. And notice how low the car is, because with the transmission up front, you don't need a drivetrain to go to the back. So you bring down the whole silhouette, so it really looked sporty.
Bill, you got anything to say on any of these?
Oh, that's the highest dollar car in.
I know. It's my favorite actually of the whole thing of the collection, just for the reason you mentioned. It's
And I
he
do
clearly
have the
put
front
it-
bumper.
yeah.
Yeah, some have a different bumper too. Well, you don't have a bumper.
I have a front bumper.
Do you have a front bumper?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very odd design. It's
Oh yeah.
We see-
Intricate.
Yeah. You just need to get it on, right? Or didn't you need to chrome it? Is that what it was, or something?
Well,
What do you have left to do?
I
on it?
have a sedan too, Jerry, and it's restored too.
Is
I've
it?
had it restored.
What color is that one, Bill?
It's blue, 2 shades of blue.
I think I've seen that before, haven't I?
I don't think it's in here, is it?
Well, you had it at the other place? At the
No.
King? Well, then I guess I didn't see it.
This car was in the other museum,
Okay.
but it was stripped down. You remember? It had the wood showing and
Oh, yeah.
huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. I had that car restored way out in Iowa. Cost me a fortune.
Not bad for
Do
that
you have
sucker.
an emblem, Bill, or do you need that yet?
I need that.
They're probably remaking it.
Oh, sure enough?
Yeah. Are you involved with the Auburn Court Duesenberg Club?
Well, I think I get the publication.
Well, check in there. There's probably somebody that's got either an original one or a
Okay.
remanufactured one.
Yeah, I need that.
Yeah. How about the cap too? Was it always just a plain cap?
Oh, I have that.
You
That's-
have that in
That's
your
on
stash
my,
area, right?
I have 2 of them, as a
Yeah,
matter
yeah,
of
yeah.
fact.
You have the Eagle for that or what?
No, it was a flat cap.
Okay.
The ones I have,
Well, sometimes,
relatively flat.
but sometimes they put a lalique on there too. I've
A
seen
what?
the lalique, the glass lalique,
Oh.
and they put an Eagle head lalique on there,
Oh.
Really?
which is nice.
Yeah, because I just found this extra one and I just put it on right for now, just
Yeah.
to make it read right.
Well, the other thing we could have done is just put our hand right there.
No, you can't see that. My gosh.
have
God bless you for being
I
so
have
picky.
2 brand new brass castings. They need to be smoothed up and chromed. But they're not the elaborate ones, no.
Well,
I
Maroon
didn't
is
know
always.
They made an elaborate one for it.
Well, Lalique was a company in France, and they would sell anything to anybody as an aftermarket.
Okay.
But a dealer that was dealing in cords would say, I like this, I like that, I'm going to offer that to the people.
Okay.
And so, and
For another $25.
yeah, right, well, probably at
Cost
least
you
that back then.
$1,000.
Yes. That's so true. Well, looking at all these cars is starting to make me hungry.
Yeah. Speed?
Speed.
So, Jerry, tell us, why did the Edsel fail?
Well, the Edsel failed because it was too good of a car at the wrong time. It took years of planning and test marketing to come up with the Edsel. Had it been introduced about 3 or 4 years before its actual introduction date, it would have been a grand success. All the statistics showed that would happen, but the market changed. The Edsel is a very fine car. People that have Edsels today brag about how wonderful they are. There's so many innovations, I can hardly begin to tell you what they are. The design is outstanding. Just look at an Edsel. Just read any article on an Edsel. You'll find out it was a great car. But it failed because of marketing and planning not hitting the mark at the right time and the right way. It's not the only one to have failed like that. Before the Edsel failed, and we say, oh, that thing's an Edsel, meaning it's a big joke, a big bust. But before the Edsel failed, people said it was the Chrysler Airflow that was the big joke. And that also had similar difficulties, and yet it was a fine, fine car. So sometimes your best gems just aren't well placed in the setting of the ring.
So, Jerry, what's the story on the DeLorean?
I'm glad you asked. Right here you have one of the most innovative cars of its era. Cars from the 1970s needed to have something that was different. Cars from the 80s tried to grab that, and of course the 90s and so forth. Every decade somebody tries to come up with a new idea. This is a new idea that's really old, a stainless steel body. How wonderful. In its day when these cars came out, people lined up to place the orders. They were spending $25,000, $26,000, $27,000 for a DeLorean made by a man by the name of DeLorean who had some great connections in the auto world and especially in America, went overseas to have the DeLorean made. He decided stainless steel was the way to go. This car's body will never rust. Problem with that is the people that were spending $26,000, $27,000 found out that after 3 or 4 years of ownership and the company went belly up, nobody wanted to buy the cars, or so it seemed. Prices went down to about $17,000, which is very unfortunate. Very interesting car with the gull wing doors on it. It is impractical, at least from my perspectives. Let me tell you why. If something were to fall on this hood and dent the hood, and you'd have to work it out, first of all, stainless is very hard to work. Secondly, you can't put putty on this and paint over it. It's a stainless steel body. So it's very impractical when it comes to collisions. Go to a supermarket, get a few dings on the side, and you'll be crying forever. But as a stylish car and as an innovative effort, it is just a marvel to behold.
Speeding. All right, quiet. So, Jerry, tell us about this Rolls Royce here.
First thing I have to tell you is people often say the hood ornament or the mascot is turned incorrectly. Well, that depends. You can twist it to the front, and then the wings go to the back, which is the way you'd think it would be flying, but if you do that, you can't really open the hood without knocking off the wings. So when you go to open the hood on a Rolls from this vintage, you have to turn the mascot in this direction. It works quite well. As people come into the museum, they'll wonder about that, so it adds to a nice little bit of information and a nice little story. Rolls Royces, of course, what can you say about a Rolls? A Rolls is a Rolls, and it's known as one of the epitomes among cars throughout the world. Some of these Rolls Royces, however, were not made in Great Britain. They were made in America. It's called a Springfield Rolls Royce. The Phantom Ones were mainly Springfield cars with bodies by Brewster, the oldest body and carriage manufacturer in America. Well, that car was only in production a little more than a dozen years or so, and the Depression got it, as happened so often to the different car manufacturers. We're going to talk a little bit here about the foreign-made cars. Rolls-Royce always had a tiny grip, or a little piece, of the automobile industry in America. And even to this day, it's fondly respected. There was one car manufacturer that tried to simulate this. Well, there were a couple. One was Romer. Another one of more local interest was Moon, the Moon motor car, made in St. Louis, Missouri. And the Moon simulated, back in about 1919, the radiator design of the Rolls, with one big difference. You see how the top of the radiator design here is squared off? The Moon, it was peaked. And because of that, the Rolls-Royce people could not sue Moon. However, they went after Romer and a few other companies. I want to also point out the other cars here, the Mercedes-Benz and also the Jaguar. Well, the Mercedes is a nice car, and when I look at that, I remember one of the first cars made in the world because the Benz automobile was one of the first original vehicles. We can credit Germans with taking the actual bow for having invented the automobile, at least the successful automobile that we came to know. And this is one of the later variations, a '69 Mercedes. Interesting thing most people don't realize, when Packard went out of business and the company was called Studebaker Packard, the Studebaker outlets needed to have a luxury car to sell, which is the market in which Packard existed. With Packard being gone, they sought the support of Mercedes. And so Studebaker dealers were selling Mercedes automobiles back in the late 50s. That's how Mercedes made its reputation initially in America, through Studebaker dealers. And then going to the Jaguar, a great car, and in recent years it had been owned by Ford. Well, Jaguar, as with many other luxury car manufacturers, has always had a tenuous history, because when you make just a small amount of cars with a high price, you better make them good, and you better stand behind it. One problem with Jaguar is, and I'll mention this as being a more immediate reference, I had a neighbor who bought a Jaguar just a few years ago, and he said he likes the car, he likes the design. No one ever would go against that statement. They're just a beauty to behold. But he said, I hope it never breaks down. So one day I noticed he wasn't driving his car around, and I said, Earl, what happened to your Jaguar? He said, well, it had to go in the shop. It needed a part. I said, how long will it take to get fixed? He said, 6 months to get the part. He didn't keep the Jaguar much longer. But when they run, they're great cars. Couldn't we say that of all vehicles made? I don't care what year they are, how old they are. An old Rolls Royce like this, an old Rolls Royce like this, or even a newer Mercedes, brand new car right off the showroom floor, or a 1909 Gazettemobile. It doesn't matter. They're supposed to get us there and back. Let's hope all the cars in this museum have had a good track record in that regard.
So, though, just to follow up, which is your favorite? Which is your favorite of all the foreign cars? Not necessarily the one in here, but what is your favorite foreign car?
Well, I suppose I would go along with the Rolls. It seems to be closest to America, and I really do appreciate American-made cars, probably a notch or two more than foreign-made cars. I would happen to say, though, that Jaguar would come in second, even if they don't always run.
Great. Best muscle car ever made was, Jerry? What do you think the best muscle car ever made was?
Okay, we're rolling. The best muscle car ever made. I like to think about performance cars and how good they were. People these days love Mustangs. Years ago, these were basically utilitarian cars. They got you there and back, but they got you there with some good design and wonderful styling. Lee Iacocca was the driving force behind that. And performance-wise, well, you know, some had the big engine, some had the small. If you had the 6-cylinder, it still got you there and back. But it got you there in real good looks. Everybody seemed to like the Mustang. Very popular car in its day, left its mark on society, and now it's become an icon. And hey, if you got to have a performance car that's an icon, Mustang has to be near the top of the list. Other people would say the Camaro. Here's a Z28. Now, talk about get up and go. Here's the car. People love the Camaro. I always like the way in which Chevrolet names some of its special models with a C. Camaro by Chevrolet, or Corvette by Chevrolet. Some people might even say, well, Corvette was its own make. No, it wasn't. It's a Corvette by Chevrolet. It's a Chevrolet model. So here's the Camaro. You can't afford a Corvette, go with the Camaro. Camaro has risen over the years in appreciation, so collectors really like them. You ask some people what is the top car on their performance car list, and they will, without hesitation, say Camaro. But so often, people love to point out the Corvette. Maybe it's a matter of a lost youth. Maybe it's a matter of a lost youth, where people who can now afford a Corvette are buying it, and they might be in their 50s, and you'll see them tooling down the road. It wasn't meant to be that way. Chevrolet had intended this car to be a sporty car for the young at heart and the young in body. But now it's become a hot collectible. People will say the classic, such as this 63 Stingray, is the car that is at the top of their performance list. And who's to say what's the best performance car? It's really up to the person who owns it and enjoys it.
Cat, you.
Bill, one of the most popular cars in its day was the Chevrolet 490. It got its name because it sold for $490, which undersold the Model T. Henry Ford realized that, so he undercut that price by $40 or so to come up even cheaper. There was only one option available on those early cars, and that was electric starting and electric headlights. This has electric headlights, so I'm guessing it has an electric start also. I think this was about a 1917, 1918, 1919 model, somewhere around there. They look all about the same, except if you want to find out what year it is, sometimes you go to the manual and it'll say on the front what the engine numbers were, and then you look inside to see what the date of the manual shows. Well, Bill, I got a question for you on this 490. If I had trouble with the engine, what would I expect once I raised the hood? Show us a little bit about what this engine looks like.
Well, we have a little bitty 4-cylinder engine that was actually not built by Chevrolet. Most people don't know that. It's built by Mason. And it does have the rocker arms overhead valves situation, which is very positive for an engine. Got away from the flat head, and more power and better acceleration and everything with the overhead valves. But you see, the cover never was on this car. There never was a cover on it. You can get somewhere between, all depend on your attitude, 50, 75, 100 miles down the road, and then you better take this little oil can. That's why it's that close. And all of this top mechanism that doesn't have any oil coming up from the bottom. simple little engine. I think it's just three main bearings. Babbitt rods, Babbitt mains. Does have a siphon system on the water, just like a Model T. There's no water. I don't think there's any water pump. Yes, there is. There's a water pump in there.
And you know, Bill, in looking through this manual, it came to my attention that the way you shift this car is different than a Model T. A Model T you really have to work at. You've got pedals on the floor.
Yeah.
But this one shifts in the regular H pattern, which sounds pretty doggone convenient by today's standards.
And it's the same pattern as is today's pattern. If you have a stick car.
Now, I got a question for you. What company in St. Louis was one of the leading manufacturers of Chevrolet? It started with a G.
You're not talking about Gardner.
I certainly am.
They built
The
several
Gardner
several
family,
Chevrolets?
yes they did. The
Oh, I
Banner
didn't
Buggy
know
Company was the dominant buggy company that was exclusive producers of buggies in the world, and they were based in St. Louis. And when the automobile business started on the rise, the buggy business started to decline. Because of that, the family, and it was run by one father and two sons, all named Gardner, decided that they would get into automobile production. And so what they did is they sought out a company, made a trip up east, got a hold of a man called Durant, who had just started a make named Chevrolet, named after a race car driver, Louis Chevrolet. And in the process, what they did is they signed a contract for the Gardner factory that made buggies to now make Chevrolets. And they would assemble these in St. Louis, and they signed to be exclusive distributors up and down the Mississippi Valley for all Chevrolets that were sold. It was great. And then World War I came along. The two sons went into the Navy. The father said to the boys, I can't handle this myself. Let's sell the company. They sold it to Chevrolet for $1 million. After the war, the boys got out and said, Dad, we'd like to get back into car production. So they bought back the plant from Chevrolet. Chevrolet had built a new plant in St. Louis. And out of that old Banner buggy and old Chevrolet plant, the Gardner automobile was produced from 1919 until 1931. And that's the story.
I did not know that.
The likelihood of this
Everyone warned me
vehicle,
there.
the likelihood of this vehicle sold in the Midwest, anywhere near the Mississippi, the likelihood is that the Gardner plant, either under their operation or under Chevrolet's operation, but the Gardner plant in St. Louis probably had its direct hand in assembling this car.
No, but that's right. Now, there's a savior in this car, and that is it was a fire chief's car. So it's been well taken care of all through the years. It's never had any rust out in it. I can't see any evidence of it ever having an accident. No dings. So it's been super taken care of
It's
all
great.
of its life.
Well, it's wonderful that it's here in the museum, Bill. Thanks.
Yeah, and just real quick, which fire department, Bill? Do you know?
Well, I kind of hated to mention that, but I understood it was Cincinnati. But would their territory have gone that far?
Probably not unless the order was placed and they needed to be shipped that type of distance. It's not an impossibility, but if the car came out of Cincinnati, it probably was not from the St. Louis plant.
That's the story that I have in my mind.
Unless they placed an order special with the plant to have it sent on over, which is not beyond the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
Speaking of fires, maybe you want to look at the next one over here. Wow, look at this one here. An Aaron's Fox pumper truck. Now, you know, you come to a car museum, you think it's only going to be cars, but this is a vehicle museum, really. I mean, there's a buggy over there that we saw, and going to see a lot of different types of motorized vehicles. Bill, tell us about this one.
This truck came out of Boston, and the people that I brought it from gave me the story on it. There was a major fire in Boston a number of years ago, and this truck sat and pumped steady 24 hours for a full 24 hours. Now the pump is tied right straight into the crankshaft on the engine. You have to throw it in. You have to make that coupling, but the pump is running at the same speed as the engine is running. And you have your suction hoses, which are along the side there, and you hook those in here, and you either go to a fire hydrant, or you go to a creek, or you go to a lake, or you go to a pond, and suck the water up. Now, the main thing, one of the things that happens on this thing is that it works so hard doing that pumping that the whole truck bounces every stroke that it makes. Now, somebody foolishly hooked these suction hoses on, and they stuck the hose over into a creek, and they laid a bed of gravel across the top of the radiator in here. It'll start and it'll run, but in about 3 minutes it's hot. It's going to be too much work to take it apart to get that out of there.
Sometimes the old vehicles create a challenge, don't they?
Oh, yeah.
One thing I noticed, this is not chrome plating. It looks like nickel plating, and I think that's pretty common for 1922, nickel plating rather than chrome. Chrome didn't come out until the late 20s, correct?
26. Anything that has chrome on it before 26 is been a re-chrome job or whatever. So normally the bright work on a car that's older than 26 is nickel, and it turns out a little bit on the gray side, instead of just real bright.
And as I recall, Oldsmobile was one of the first big makes to popularize the use of chrome.
Now the ball up on top is a cushion. When this is pumping, if you're just pumping water won't do it. You can't compress water. So to save the pistons and whatever from being damaged, that's just an air chamber. So you're pumping against air, and that evens out. And the guy on the other end of the hose, instead of getting boom, 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 well, he's getting a steady stream of water too.
Sounds great. Well, thanks for the walkthrough. I found it very interesting. So many different makes of cars were manufactured in America. Now, it just boggles the mind. This is a Hupmobile. The big H on the top, big H on the insignia here in the front. Hupmobiles were well-respected cars. They were made right up until the beginning of World War II. And in the later years, they even used cord body dies. Remember the cord we talked about before? Well, in the mid-30s, the final cord body came out. And after the company went out of business, they literally sold the body dies. And 2 cars were manufactured with those body dies, but they were rear-wheel drive cars. The one was Hupmobile, the other was Graham. Here's a Hupmobile. Hupmobiles, again, well-liked, had a specific following, and therefore it had a niche among its sales clientele. And that's how some of these companies existed. They specialized in niche selling to their own people that they had brought up with Hupmobile. Loyalty, that's what made the make continue. Chevrolet is a little bit different case. Mass producer, they finally went head-to-head against Ford, finally became USA 1. And in so doing, by becoming USA 1, they set their own pattern for success. And Ford had to try to catch up to Chevrolet. And it's been neck and neck for the 2 makes ever since. In the early 1930s, I don't think there was any car made in America that was ugly. They were all so nicely styled. You had your freestanding headlights, wonderful flowing designs on the fenders. The hoods looked very majestic. Your hood mascot, in this case, an eagle, was up the front. Notice only one windshield wiper, and it's at the bottom of the windshield instead of the top. A spotlight, side lamps here. These were all little niceties along with the side-mounted spare tire that you'd have that set this car apart. It might have been a low-priced car, but it didn't look it by any stretch of the imagination. And we go to the other Chevrolet over here. A little bit different design. It has disc wheels instead of wire wheels. If you come to the museum, you can see what I'm talking about. They're solid wheels. You can see a close-up later. Sometimes cars came with a mascot, sometimes they didn't. Why? Well, wouldn't you think that would be the first thing to be stolen or broken? Why should somebody risk paying a little extra to get something that they'll lose? And so it was. Today, we hardly find a car that has a mascot on the hood. But back in the early 30s, that was the way to go.
This is 29. 1928 had a 4-cylinder engine. And when they went to 29, well, they moved to a 6-cylinder engine, a lot smoother, a lot more power.
Yep.
Pontiac. Wow, right from the early 30s. What's this one? People might say when they come to the museum. It's a Hudson 8, a Hudson. I remember when Grandpa had one or Dad had one. Hudson. That was one of the respected names in America. Hudson. It went into the dim light of history in the late 1950s. But for a time, Hudson was one of the wonderful makes in America. Named after, believe it or not, a gentleman that owned some big outlet stores in the Detroit area. And sometimes these cars appeared in the store itself on the floor, being sold right alongside garments. It was interesting. Over here, the other car you have to look at, this Franklin. Air-cooled Franklin. That's what Franklins were known for. Not water-cooled, but air-cooled. As such, the bodies were light, the metal was light, they could perform better, and just became a super, super deal. A lot of people consider the Franklin to be a classic car. What is a classic? Let me tell you briefly what a classic is. If a car has some outstanding features, was low production, was high in cost, and just oozes class, it's a classic. Some people will say that's a Chevrolet Corvette. Perhaps, but that's classic with a small c in the books of people from various classic car clubs. They would say this car is a true classic with a big C. I guess it's just your perspective on the hobby, but I kind of like that idea.
Beautiful.
The lovely It's DeSoto. That was the way they'd roll these things out of the factory way back when. Well, maybe not in the vintage of this vehicle from the 30s, but in later years, that's the way it went. They had songs, jingles on the radio. Radio was up and coming in the 20s. By the 30s, it was big business. DeSoto was there to advertise. The interesting thing about this DeSoto is its frontal arrangement. There's no other car made in America in the early 30s that had that type of design. Everyone else was squared off, boxy, very strict lines. This car predicted the future. Too bad we don't have DeSoto with us today. They went by the wayside in 1961, but the memory still lingers here at the museum. I'll take two 32s and a 38. Make it fast, barkeep. Well, you might try to place an order like that if you went into a bar, but if you went into a car dealership, you'd never be able to buy a 32, a 32, a 38 like this at the same dealership in all probability. First of all, we have the magnificent Rio Royale. Rio. We talked a little bit about Rio earlier. Rio. Ransom E. Olds. That's where the letters came from. Became its own car manufacturer when Mr. Olds decided to start the company. He left Oldsmobile by that time, and he competed with them out of Lansing, Michigan. The Rio Royale is a true classy looking car, so I'd call it a true classic. Notice the design and the headlights, not quite round, but very distinctive. The peak in the front, very stylish. Even the bend in the bar to make the peak happen. By the way, these are shutters to help regulate the heat and cold to keep that radiator running like it should. The side lights here on the fenders, very nice, and they match the headlights. That's the way styling was back then. Now let's look at another car from 32. We have here the Nash. It has some similarities to the Rio over there. Although Nash was not quite as expensive as the Rio Royale, nor was it quite as classy, if I may say that. Now some Nash people may say, how dare I say that? I'm not bad-mouthing Nash, but Nash was in a slightly different niche in the industry. And yet, it was a great place. Charlie Nash had been the head of General Motors and left and formed the Nash Company. Now, there's a lot of history on that, and I won't go into details. You can read that in a book. When you come to the museum, you'll be able to stare history in the face by standing in front of a car like this and say, now I have seen the Nash. 32, 32. There's a difference, and I like both of them. But now let's go to 38. Over here we have the 38 Buick. It's a four-door sedan. I'm going to tell you something about a four-door sedan. On some of the earlier cars that we've shown you here in the museum, they're touring cars, which means they're open, the top folds down and all. Until the 1920s, the mid-1920s, it was the open car that was the most successful style in America. But then the sedan gained prominence. The Essex was among the first cars to popularize that in a lower price field. Buick, in the higher price field, well, really upper medium price, liked to go with a sedan too. The sedans were considered really great cars. Now, a touring car initially might have sold for $1,200, whereas a sedan by the same make back in the mid-20s might have sold for, believe it or not, $2,500, about $1,000 more. As time went on, by the time of 1938, it was reversed, so that a convertible, which would be considered a Phaeton, if you will, a touring car, would have been maybe another half time more than the sedan. It's a matter of supply and demand. It's also a matter of changing desires in the market. A Buick. We know what Buick is today. Now you see what Buick was in 38. There was a man named Cadillac. He basically was the founder of Detroit. We're going way, way back, of course, when we say that. He had a friend, an assistant, whose name was LaSalle. When Cadillac decided in the late 1920s to come up with a companion car, it went to the LaSalle name, and it applied it on the slightly lower priced car made by Cadillac. So you had Cadillacs and LaSalles very prominently displayed at Cadillac dealerships. There were no LaSalle dealerships just by their own. This is a LaSalle, and I think it's really great. Notice the colors. A lot of people think black was the most prominent color in old cars. It's not true, especially on an open car like this. With top down, who'd want a black car? Well, some people would like a black one, but most people like sportier colors. A gold or a tan with special brown accents and pinstripe. I've got to point out the pinstripe. Applied by hand way back when. Today, of course, people use tape in the factories. It's not done by hand anymore. Done by a machine, by tape, and all that stuff. But in days of yore, this was all done by hand. They had gentlemen who were craftsmen, some of them from the old world, and they would spend nothing but the whole day, 8 to 10 hours a day, doing that stripe. Their hand had to be steady, their eye had to be sure, and they didn't have bright lights like we have today. Craftsmanship, quality, that's what went into a LaSalle and so many old cars from the past. Great to see it here.
Yep. Action.
When you come to the Auto World Museum, you'll be able to rest your feet a while because there's wonderful benches all over here. And you'll be able to pause and ponder the lines of a car like this 1941 Packard 120. It was called 120 because that basically was its wheelbase, 120 inches. It's funny how people have named cars after little things like measurements or horsepower or things like that. But there's more behind that name, 120. For Packard, it was the name that saved the company. Back in the Depression, Packard needed to come out with a car that would sell well. And so they applied the Packard name to a medium-priced car called the Packard 120. And that happened in 1935. It basically saved the company. And it also did one other thing. It hurt the competition so bad that LaSalle could never quite catch up. So the name LaSalle was phased out in favor of a slightly lower-priced Cadillac selling in that same range, so that it wasn't just Packard that offered a 120 at the medium price range, but Cadillac also. And so it was right before World War II.
Lovely.
Here's this one again, Bill?
41.
31.
31. 31, excuse me.
Howard Marmon made a car named after him, and I'll tell you, it was just an engineering challenge to come up with a car that could operate so well as this V16. That's right, a V16, a 16-cylinder car. The only other big name behind a 16-cylinder car at that time was Cadillac. 1931, Howard Marmon came out with this car. He didn't care how many he made, that wasn't the point. He wanted to make quality, that was number one. And that was so often the case with all the car makers back in those days. It was important because you're talking about a Depression era. So quality became costly, and some companies did not survive because of it. Unfortunately, Marmon as a car company went by the wayside because they put quality first, and they didn't make the money they needed. Going to show you something on this car. Some people say, car has suicide doors. Well, the front door opens as normal would on a car today. This one in the back, though, opens to the back of the car, which means suicide. Why was it called suicide? Well, if you're seated in that rear seat and you're going down the road at a high speed and the door flies open, you could just be blown right out. At least that's what people thought. So they called that a suicide door. I don't know that anybody committed suicide by opening the door, but it sounded good if the competition had doors that closed the other way. Thank you, Mr. Marmon, for having made a great car. We hope this one lasts forever.
Yeah.
I mean, the V16
Really
Cadillacs
made
are
to-
rare, let alone a Marmon.
Made to compete with the Duesenberg from the bottom up.
Pin job.
There can't be but maybe a dozen V16 Marmons in existence total in all the different body styles. Well, maybe I'm wrong, but I would guess
Oh, I expect you're right.
there's about a dozen.
In the world.
In the world, that's
In
it.
the world.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to talk about Continental.
And looks like we're still rolling. Take a moment and at your leisure.
When Continental came out in 1940, and basically the 41 models looked the same, people said, wow, when they saw it. Well, it was Edsel Ford, the son of Henry Ford, who came up with this style, and he tried it out among his friends at the various country clubs and places where society gathered back in those days. And they said, we like that design. So he went back to the factory and said, let's take this and make it into the new generation Lincoln. We'll call it the Continental, because that was the catchy thing. It was called Continental, sounded like European. It wasn't European, it was made in America. Very, very, very nice design, like the front of a ship here, cutting the wind on the highway, leaving waves behind with the traffic in its wake. In the back of the car, I don't have to show you, you know what it's like, there's a Continental kit. Why do you think they called it a Continental kit? Because the spare tire was on this model, the Continental. It really set a standard for the industry. Very good car, with one exception. Sometimes the V8s didn't last as well as they should have, acted up just a bit. People know how to fix them now, but back when the cars were relatively recent, there were difficulties with some of the engines. That did not stop Lincoln, though. We're going to walk to the other one now and talk about that. This would be called the Lincoln Continental Mark I. This is the Mark II. In 1956 and 57, you had the Mark II that came out. If you look at this closely and you keep in mind the early generation Ford T-Bird, you'll see a definite family relationship. This is like a T-Bird with a glandular disorder on the good side. It's a T-Bird that's enlarged. Wow, bigger is better, so let's take a T-Bird that's a hot design and make it bigger. There you have the Continental. These cars lost money for Ford with every one that was made. Well, I mean, they cost something like $8,000, $9,000, $10,000. That's about what the cost was in each one. They only made a handful. Well, a handful is several hundred for each of those 2 years. But I got to tell you, I liked the Mark II, and it was definitely a good continuation of the Continental name. Not all Lincolns are Continentals, but when it comes to the epitome of a Lincoln, it is the Continental. There's one more to look at now. Here we have the 69 Continental Mark III. That's right. If Mark I was good and Mark II was just as good or close to it, then Mark III has to be equally so. That was the hope and the intention of the Ford people. They intended to make a car that was every bit in the tradition of the previous Mark series. Mark it on your note. This is it. Mark it well in your memory. This is the car to buy. Mark it well in your bank account when you put down the down payment or you write the check for the full amount. This was the idea. It was a mark in history. It was a mark in automotive design. Huge hood back in the 70s and late 60s. Here, a 69 hideaway headlights. That hood just expands forever. Bigger truly was better back in those days. And Lincoln was there to prove it. I like the idea of the vinyl top. It wasn't the first year for that. Some cars had that back in the 50s. But if you really wanted to have a classy Mark III in 1969, you had to have it there. Great car, great styling, great luxury, and a car we should never forget. Now you mark that one in your book.
And we're ready.
Henry J. Kaiser. Remember that name. He was big during World War II. He made it big because he was involved in defense production, especially the building of ships on the West Coast. After World War II, he decided to turn his money and his empire toward automobile production because he said, why should the big three and the little four, Hudson, Nash, Packard, and Studebaker, and the big three being Chevy, Ford, and Chrysler, why should they have the market all sewed up? Why can't we have a new make? And let's name it Kaiser. So he joined forces with what was left of the Graham Company, and they came out with the Kaiser and the Fraser. Kaiser was named after Henry J. Kaiser. There was a companion car also called the Henry J. It was a lot smaller. That was an interesting car in its own right, but we'll reserve our comments here for the Kaiser. What was so great about this car? Its Continental engine, a 6-cylinder, very economical. The car, however, was a little sluggish, and its pep was on the weak side. It had a little bit, but on the weak side. And yet the style on this car, it set a standard for the future. This had the biggest, what you'd call, greenhouse of any car of its day, the most windshield and window space of any car in the early 50s. Now, because of that, you needed to keep some of the sun out, so a lot of people added an outside sun visor. Outside sun visors pretty well went by the wayside in the mid-1950s, but before that time, they were quite the thing to have. They were also good in driving in the rain because it allowed the air to scoop off of the front of the car, off of the hood, and then the shield scooped it away so that you didn't have much rain hitting the windshield. As a result, the windshield wipers sometimes were neglected. Pure air movement kept the windshield nice and clear. Whereas Kaiser today, it's in the history books, and that's it. Why is that? Well, as much as Henry J. Kaiser had an empire behind his car, and he had a dream behind his make, and he had a lot of innovations with interior styling also, it just couldn't hack it. The big three were pretty big, and the small four, the independents, had their shares also. Kaiser flourished for a time, but by 1955 it was done, and the name faded, except for one country, Argentina, where the dies were shipped and the cars continued being made up until the early 1960s. Yes, an American-made car overseas. And sometimes, if you're in Argentina, you might just happen to see one of Henry J. Kaiser's cars.
Oh, how about the Fraser?
A question was asked about the Fraser. Good question. Fraser. We mentioned Kaiser. What happened about Fraser? Well, the man who headed up the Graham Company, Joseph Fraser, had his background in Chrysler, and then he was involved for a while in Jeep. And they decided that that company had the edge on car understanding. In other words, they had the knowledge and experience on how to make cars. Henry J. Kaiser knew how to build ships. So Joseph Fraser more or less headed up the company, at least for a time. He and Mr. Kaiser did not see eye to eye, but they did produce a higher-priced car called the Fraser. Quite nice. By 1951, Mr. Fraser was out of the company, no longer associated, and that was the last year for the car bearing his name. So if you see a Fraser on the streets, tip your hat or your cap and remember Joe.
All right, ready when you are.
For people who grew up in the 1960s, they might say, "Holy Monza, Batman!" Well, here it is. Here's a Monza right here, only it's a Corvair Monza by Chevrolet. Corvairs really had their niche in sales. Why was that? They were air-cooled. So the engine was in the trunk, more or less. Your trunk was in the front. They used to have advertisements when the Corvairs were first introduced, where you go into a service station, and when the attendant, and back in those days they would have attendants come out and check your oil and pump the gas, all in their uniforms with their caps. When the attendant would go to check the engine under the hood and raise the hood, he'd stand there and he'd look around. There was no engine. It's in the back. One bad thing about a rear engine, sometimes it doesn't get all the, what shall we say, clearing of the air like it should. And so sometimes there's kind of an oily residue buildup that accumulated around some of the vents. Well, if you had a Corvair, you learned to live with that. Some people literally swore by these cars. Other people swore at these cars. But nonetheless, they left their mark on our history. And I got to tell you, I think a Corvair is definitely worth seeing, whether in a museum like this or any other place on the road. Holy Monza, Batman! I like it.
Cut.
47 Hudson. Twin H power. Twin H. Wow. Extra carburation. Extra get up and go. Wow. On a pickup truck? Pickups are popular now and in recent years. Believe it or not, in 46 and 47, it was hard to get any type of new car, let alone a pickup truck. My goodness, the lists were long, the wait was equally so, and you usually paid extra. Some dealers even said, not necessarily Hudson dealers, but any type of dealer would be tempted to say, little extra cash, it'll put you to the top of the list to get your next new car. I don't know that Hudson ever did that, but might have been tempted. Wow. Little extra money for a car like this? A car that's really a pickup truck? Is it a pickup truck? No. I think it's a car. Depends on how your perspective is. It definitely didn't have a back seat, only had one front seat, but from here on back, hey, it's a pickup truck. I've got to think that maybe Hudson just did an easy job of sectioning these, and the front was more or less taken right off of a car assembly line. Now, I may be wrong on that, but that's the way it looks. As for the bed, nice and long, and hey, this is a medium-priced vehicle, which meant when you showed up in a pickup like this, you had arrived. This was a fancy thing to have. This isn't your low-end, run-of-the-mill pickup. This one oozes class, and Hudson was known for that. If you own a Hudson or know of somebody that does, ask them what they think of Hudson, and you'll find out how good a car or pickup it really was. One thing that I will forever remember about the Auto World Museum is the whole series of backdrops that act like a wonderful frame around a classic picture. A lot of these backdrops represent history that's local to Fulton and the environment around. Well, I'll let that setting talk for itself whenever you come to the museum, and hopefully you'll fondly remember some of these sites and tell others about it. That's the frame. Let's look at the classic picture. The Ford retractable hardtop. Retractable hardtop. Only made for a couple years in the late 1950s. It has its own cult following, and I can see why. Here's a top that literally automatically folds down. You can see it's in the partial act of doing that even as I'm speaking here. It's hinged. Different compartments flow this way and that way. It goes into the trunk area, which means you don't have a lot of space for storage back in the trunk. But did you really need it on a car like this? This car was meant to be sporty. This is what you took for fun. This is what you took for excitement and enjoyment. You didn't take it to the store necessarily. Don't worry about opening up the trunk. If you had to stop by to get a bag of groceries, the back seat is spacious enough. Just set it there and enjoy the fact that you have a retractable hardtop. Yes, a full convertible when the top is down and a full hardtop when the top is up. Ford had something going for it when it came out with this model. I just kind of wish it would have continued. But as many good things in the past, they go by the side. They go into history, but they're not forgotten. You know, everybody should have the fun that this car probably gave its owners when they first bought it. And that's something that old cars can give us. A memory, a lapse to the future, an appreciation for the past, and sometimes a former moment relived. Thank you, Ford, for the retractable hardtop.
Jerry, and Jaguar doing about that now?
There were other companies that had hardtops and retractables and gull wings, and all sorts of experiments were done with tops. It almost was a sales gimmick, if you will, to come up with a sedan or a hardtop that looked pretty standard, but come up with a little extra click in the dial to make it get your attention. Other manufacturers did that. I also want to point out one more thing before we leave this car. This has air conditioning in it. And that's an add-on air conditioner. Air conditioning started back with the 1940 Packards. Packard was the first car to come up with factory air conditioning, and they were only installed at the factory back then. And then World War II hit. Well, after the war, it wasn't until about 1953 when cars came out with air conditioning again. That's right, it waited that long. Why? because there was a material shortage. A lot of metals had been used during the war to gain freedom and stability for the world. When air conditioning finally became viable again, Cadillac jumped in with both feet. Packard followed soon after, and pretty soon, one by one, all the car makers were there. If you happened to buy a car and later on wanted to have it air conditioned, your option was to go back to the dealer and have a special add-on system that would hang down from the dash and would give you pretty good cooling. Sometimes people say it was so good they literally saw flakes of snow flying out, and I have no reason to deny that. Those truly were the days. And that, my friend, is no snow job. Car owned! Various modes of transportation, various ways to power the car. Here we have from Renault, we would say today. Back in its day, most Americans said Renault. Here we have an electric from 1975. It has a compartment with 6 batteries in the front. Yeah, boy, that's a lot of electricity. It'll get you around. Electric cars are nothing relatively new. Honestly, in the automobile industry back as early as 1900, it was still a toss-up whether cars would be powered by gasoline, by electricity, or by steam. What was against gasoline was the fact that it was volatile. Believe it or not, gasoline was a byproduct of kerosene, and people would buy kerosene for their lamps, and the gasoline very often was seen as too dangerous, and it was destroyed as a byproduct. Nobody would buy it. When the internal combustion engine became popularized, kerosene was just not strong enough with its octane to create the ignition power needed. So, gasoline was looked at, and the whole market for gasoline just burgeoned thereafter. Electricity started diminishing, although electric cars were made in America and popular among a certain segment of society up until the end of the 1920s. Usually, dowagers, women of position, women of age, would drive these cars because the electrics didn't smell like a gas car, didn't act up like a gas car, were easier to operate, oftentimes with a tiller device instead of a steering wheel. Very high and boxy, you could go in with your high hat on. Very comfortable. Some cars, even you drive the electric car from the back seat and the front seats would swivel around. You could have a little parlor conversation as you drove down the road at the neck-breaking speed of about 15 miles an hour. I'm sure this Renault, excuse me for saying it that way, could do better than that speed. Now, another alternate form of power was steam. Here we have a Stanley steam car, Stanley steamers. Oh, we often know that name. People even say it today. That's a Stanley steamer. As if Stanley and steamer were all one name. It wasn't. It was a Stanley powered by steam. This is where it all happened, folks. There's all sorts of stuff in there. I could mention asbestos and things like that, but I won't. I don't know that they always used asbestos, but they had different aspects in there, different elements, different materials that would hold the things back. In fact, back up. Cut that part out. Don't even mention asbestos. Let's go back on this, okay? Here you have where it all takes place. This is where the steam is generated, right here. Folks, I got to tell you, there's a marvel under all that metal. There are bunches of tubes, and I once had a Stanley owner tell me, you don't want to flash your boiler. And I thought, well, I'll look the other way if you're going to flash your boiler. He said, no, it's not like that at all. If you run it when the water's too low, it flashes, which means it doesn't help the pipes. And he said he had to remove every pipe individually, hit it with a special hammer at a certain way until it brought back a certain sound, and it would pop back in place, and he'd put it back in. I said, well, how many times did you have to do that? 3 or 4? He said, well, I don't know. It was by the 10s and the 20s. That's how many pipes are in there. So you don't want to flash your boiler at any time and cause the problem. Now imagine you're trying to fire this thing up. Doesn't fire up within a minute, doesn't fire up within 5 minutes. Sometimes it took longer. On the earlier steamers, it could take you a half hour perhaps to get going. And besides that, on a cold winter's day, you'd have to pour the water in there. You can't leave it stay overnight. My goodness. Very inconvenient by the standards back then and even today. And various controls here look like plumbing in a house. Well, if you're trying to drive an automobile, I think you'd rather leave the plumbing behind and go out and drive a car that looks like one and acts like one and sounds like one. Stanley, though, had a great reputation, and the one thing they had behind them in the early years, probably up until about 1910 or 1915, was a great burst of speed when that full head of steam was developed. And I'll tell you, they could outpace even the best internal combustion car in its day, at least in the short run. Well, Mr. Stanley, you made a good car. There were other cars that came that were nearly perfect, like the Doble steamer. Great car. Like to have one here at the museum. Maybe one day one will show up. You ought to come by and see what happens with the cars that get added to the collection as time goes on. In the meantime, this Stanley fits a great niche of alternative fuels. Thanks again.
Beautiful.
Go back in time to 1915. You'll do that as soon as you come into the museum. One of the first cars on exhibit is this 1915 Hupp, made by Robert Hupp in Detroit. A fine car in many ways. A reliable car, which was very important in 1915. A car company could go out of business if the car did not get you there and back. There was an old song back in those days that said he'd have to get out and get under his little automobile. And that was the trick. People didn't have many garages to go to for work. You had a blacksmith shop to fix the place, to fix the car. Those blacksmith shops that fixed the cars could only do so much because they needed special training. They didn't get that in school. You had to get that through mail order catalogs and various courses. In 1915, you also had something that was different. As the owner got out and got under to fix his own car, he'd get up and he'd see the headlights. Notice how high the headlights are on this Hupp. Wow, they're really up there high. Why is that? To light the road ahead. I don't know of any other car manufacturer that had those headlamps up so high. But this became a styling feature, a statement, if you will, of a Huppmobile. Another thing I want to point out, when you got into the Hupp back in 1915, you only had about 10 inches of space from the edge of the seat to the rest of the door jamb, about 10 inches. If you had big boots, you had a tough fit. Notice also the door opens to the back, not toward the front, which made for interesting conversation if you didn't quite clear the door as you were going in. Don't snag any clothing or you might grin and bear it. Those were some of the foibles of the old days with automobiles, and we've come a long way. Cars are a lot more convenient, a lot more comfortable. You don't have to squeeze through 10 inches of space to get into the door of a car today. And thank God that it's changed. You can be grateful for the industry and the advancements it's made, and you'll definitely see that progress here at the museum.
Stop before you move. I want you to say drive through history at Auto World. Give me a second.
Drive through history at Auto World.
On the first take. What a pro. Beautiful. Don't you wish I could do that?